On a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey stands a monument from a world almost beyond. Its name is Göbekli Tepe. Thousands of years before Stonehenge or the Egyptian pyramids, people gathered on this hill and raised enormous. They had no metal. They left no written record. Even pottery had not yet become part of everyday. Yet they carved limestone pillars, arranged them inside carefully planned enclosures, and decorated many of them with images of foxes, boars, snakes, birds, and predators with exposed teeth. Some of the largest pillars rise more than 5 meters. At the center of several enclosures, two taller pillars. They have no visible, but carved arms, hands, belts, and clothing suggest that they represent human-like beings. The earliest monumental structures at Göbekli Tepe date to around 90 C. This places them near the beginning of the Neolithic. It was a time when communities across the region were changing how they lived, gathered food, and the hill was first recorded during an archaeological survey in 1960, but its prehistoric importance was not fully recognized until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt examined the site in 1994. Excavations began the following. What emerged beneath the soil challenged a familiar. Monumental architecture was once closely associated with farmers, permanent settlements, political leaders, and reliable food surplus. But the earliest builders here still depended heavily on hunting. They were not members of a forgotten technological system. There is no evidence of metal machinery, advanced cutting devices, or mysterious outside builders. The pillars were carved from local limestone using tools available during the Stone Age. But ordinary tools do not make this an ordinary achievement. Construction required planning. It required cooperation. And it required a reason powerful enough to bring people together. Göbekli Tepe is often called the world Euro. That description is memorable, but it is more certain than the evidence. The buildings may have hosted rituals, feasts, gatherings, or ceremonies connected. They may also have stood beside spaces used for everyday life. The deeper archaeologists investigate, the less simple the site becomes. The real mystery is not whether prehistoric people could build it. They clearly did. The mystery is why they chose to. To understand why Göbekli Tepe was built, we must enter a world. More than 11,000 years ago, this part of southeastern Anatolia belonged to a wider region now called Upper Mesopotamia. It lay near the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. The landscape was different. Open grasslands, patches of woodland, and river valleys supported large populations of wild animals. Gazelles moved across the. Wild cattle, boar, sheep, and deer lived throughout the region. Wild forms of wheat and barley also grew here. The people who used Göbekli Tepe obtained much of their food by hunting animals and gathering plants. For that reason, archaeologists describe them as hunter-gatherers. But that label can create the wrong image. They were not necessarily small groups wandering without permanent connections or organized traditions. Across Southwest Asia, some communities were already living in one place. They built houses. They stored food. They processed wild grain, and they maintained relationships with other communities across considerable distances. The Neolithic transition did not happen. People did not suddenly abandon hunting, plant feed. The process unfolded over many generations. Different communities experimented with new foods, new settlement patterns, and new ways of working. Göbekli Tepe belongs to this period of transformation. Animal bones found at the site show that wild species remained important. Stone tools reveal hunting, cutting, and food processing. Grinding equipment indicates that cereals and other plants were all. The earliest monumental enclosures, therefore, appeared during a period of social change before fully established farming villages came to dominate the region. This distinction. The builders did not need cities, kings, or a lost technology to cooperate. Hunter-gatherer societies could preserve detailed knowledge of landscapes, animals, stone, and seasonal. They could form alliances. They could organize gatherings. And under the right conditions, they could bring many people together for a shared purpose. Such gatherings may help explain how the builders found enough labor to quarry, transport, and raise the pillars. They may also explain the large quantities of animal remains discovered around the structure. Some researchers interpret this evidence as the remains of communal feasts. Food would have served a practical purpose by supporting workers. But eating together could also create alliances, settle obligations, and reinforce a shared identity. This does not prove that feasting caused people to build Göbekli Tepe. It reveals something. The society behind the monument was already capable of complex cooperation. These were not primitive people waiting for civilization to begin. They were active participants in the changes that would eventually produce settled farming communities. And the clearest evidence of their shared world still stands in stone. At first glance, the pillars of Göbekli Tepe appear almost abstract. Each has a long vertical body topped by a wide horizontal section. Together, they form the shape of a capital letter T. But when archaeologists examined them closely, the stone forms began to look less like architectural supports and more like people. Several pillars have arms carved along their side. Their hands meet across. Some wear belts. Others display what appear to be garments or loincloth. The wide top of each pillar may represent a head shown from. The vertical shaft becomes the. If this interpretation is correct, the great pillars were not simply holding up a building. They were standing inside it as silent human-like figures. The clearest examples appear in the large circular and oval enclosures from the earliest. Smaller T-shaped pillars form a ring around the interior. Most face toward the center. There, two larger pillars stand side by side, dominating the space around. One of the best preserved examples is known as its central figures rise above the surrounding pillars. Carved arms run down their side. Hands rest across their. Belts and other details give each figure a distinct identity. Yet neither has a clearly carved. That absence may have been intentional. They may have represented ancestors, spirits, or beings from a shared mythology. Without writing, their identities remain unknown. The surrounding pillars carry another. Wild animals appear across their surface. Foxes move along the stone. Snakes twist into dense patterns. Boars bend forward aggressively. There are also gazelles, wild cattle, birds, insects, and scorpions. Some were carved as shallow reliefs. Others project outward from the stone, giving them an. These images are sometimes described as hunting, but many do not show hunters, weapons, or a clear sequence of events. They may not record ordinary encounters with animals at all. The creatures could represent danger, group identity, or stories shared during. Similar symbols appear at other early Neolithic sites in the region. That suggests the builders participated in a wider cultural world rather than living as an isolated community. But the images are not a code that archaeologists can simply translate. A fox does not necessarily mean the same thing in every context. A vulture may relate to death in one context and something entirely different in another. Modern interpretation. Some researchers have connected individual carvings with constellations, cosmic disasters, or forgotten astronomical knowledge. These ideas attract attention because the symbols are mysterious. But mystery alone. What the pillars demonstrate is their makers could transform stone into recognizable bodies and animals. They understood proportion, repetition, and visual. They created spaces in which architecture and imagery worked together. Whatever happened inside these enclosures, the central figures were meant to be seen. And before they could stand over those gatherings, each one had to be cut from the living rock, moved across the hill, and raised into position. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not have. The hill itself is formed from limestone. Across the plateau, archaeologists have identified quarry areas, cutting marks, and pillars that were never completed. These unfinished stones preserve part of the construction. The builders began by selecting a suitable section of exposed. They then cut channels around the outline of a pillar. Hammerstones could break and crush the surface. Sharper tools made from flint could shape edges and carve finer detail. By deepening the channels, workers gradually separated the sides of the future. The most difficult stage came underneath. To release the block, the builders had to remove or fracture the remaining connection. A single mistake could split the limestone and destroy days or weeks of. Evidence from the quarry suggests that some pillars were abandoned before they were finished. Perhaps perhaps the stone proved unsuitable, or perhaps the construction plan changed before the pillar was removed. Once freed, a large pillar still had to reach its enclosure. Some of the quarries were located relatively close to the building, but even a short journey was. The largest central pillars exceeded 5 meters in height and weighed several tons. There were no wheeled vehicles, no cranes, and no animals trained to pull such loads. The exact transport system remains unknown. Ropes made from plant fibers or animal material could have allowed teams of workers to pull in unison. Wooden sledges may have reduced friction and protected the carved stone. Levers could have helped workers move the pillar a short distance. Prepared tracks or temporary ramps may also have been, but no surviving evidence proves which combination. The final challenge was raising the pillar. Workers may have guided its base into a prepared socket while ropes, levers, and an earthen ramp. Once upright, its base could be secured and the surrounding floor completed. This process did not require impossible technology, but it demanded experience. The builders needed to understand how limestone. They needed to anticipate the balance of a heavy blow, and they needed people to pull, guide, stabilize, and communicate at the same moment. The architecture also suggests that the work followed a plan. The pillars were not placed randomly. Smaller pillars formed ordered rings around larger central walls connected many of the surrounding entrances, benches, floors, and interior features were positioned in relation to the main figures. One geometric study found that the centers of 3 major enclosures may form an approximately equilateral triangle. If intentional, this suggests coordinated planning, not advanced or forgotten mathematics. Practical geometry can emerge from ropes, repeated measurements, and experience. Construction at Göbekli Tepe also changed over time. Enclosures were repaired. Some were modified. Later, buildings became smaller and more rectangular. This was not one project completed, but it was a continuing tradition maintained across many generations. The precise number of workers remains unknown. Claims involving hundreds or thousands usually depend. What the pillars clearly required was coordinated labor, food, time, knowledge, and social. Stone tools explain how the material. Ropes, levers, and ramps offer plausible ways to move it. But engineering alone cannot explain why generations continued returning to. For that, we must ask what happened. Gobekli Tepe is often introduced with it was a temple. But archaeology rarely gives simple answers. No inscription identifies, no surviving text, and no witness explains what people did between the pillars. The architecture does suggest that these were special spaces. Stone benches ran along parts of the wall. The surrounding pillars faced inward. 2 larger human-like figures dominated. Anyone entering the enclosure would have been surrounded by stone bodies, wild animals, and repeated symbols. That setting seems designed for shared activity. But shared activity can take many forms. It might include ceremony, storytelling, initiation, negotiation, or the remembrance of the dead. The material left behind offers further clues. The fill inside and around the buildings contained enormous quantities. Gazelle was especially wild cattle, boar, deer, and other species. Many bones display evidence of butchering. These were not the remains of domesticated livestock. The meat came largely from hunted animals. Researchers have proposed that some of these remains came from communal feasts. Large gatherings would have required food. A successful hunt could supply workers and visitors, while shared meals strengthened alliances between groups. Plants were. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of grinding stones, mortars, pestles, and other food processing. Microscopic wear indicates that many were used. Stone vessels suggest that food or liquid could be prepared in significant quantities. Fermented drinks have been proposed, but a container cannot reveal. The site may also have been connected with death. Fragments of human bone have been recovered from the archaeological deposit. Several skull fragments carry cut marks associated with deliberate processing after death. A small number were modified with deep grooves or holes. These actions suggest that human remains sometimes played a role in ritual behavior. But no conventional cemetery has been uncovered inside the monumental enclosures, and the evidence does not prove humans. It may reflect secondary burial practices, ancestor rituals, or the display of skulls. This is why the phrase a euro edampel complexa euro can be misleading. It separates sacred activity from daily life in a way that may not have existed for the builders. Food preparation, construction, hunting, ceremony, and social negotiation could all occur. More recent research has also drawn attention to smaller buildings and evidence of everyday activity. Some people may have remained at the site for extended. Others may have arrived during particular seasons. Gobekli Tepe could therefore have been a settlement, a meeting place, and a ceremonial center at the same time. The evidence supports several overlaps. It does not support a single dramatic explanation. People came here to work. They hunted and they entered spaces filled with powerful. They may have honored the dead and reinforced relationships with the living. Then, over time, the buildings changed. Some were repaired, some were dismantled, and eventually, their interiors were filled with stone, soil, bones, and broken objects. Whether that filling represented burial, renewal, abandonment, or ordinary rebuilding leads to the final mystery. For years, the final chapter of Göbekli Tepe seemed almost as mysterious as its beginning. Because the enclosures were found beneath stone, soil, bones, and broken artifacts, they were once believed to have been deliberately. Some imagined a final ritual or an attempt to hide sacred knowledge from disaster. The evidence now reveals a more complicated. The buildings were not covered in one moment. Some material was probably deposited by people as they constructed new spaces, repaired walls, or disposed of debris. Other layers entered the enclosures. Heavy rain, erosion, earthquakes, and landslides could carry sediment and rubble downhill. Archaeologists have identified separate filling events that occurred at different times. They have also found evidence of damage following. Walls were rebuilt. Interior spaces and pillars from older structures were sometimes. Göbekli Tepe was not a finished monument that remained unchanged until someone decided to hide it. It was a living construction site. Generation after generation returned to build, repair, transform, and sometimes abandon its structure. Over time, the enormous circular enclosures. Later buildings were generally smaller and more rectangular. By around 8200 B.C., major construction activity at the mound had ended. Why the tradition stopped? The communities of the region. Farming was becoming more established. Settlements were developing new forms of architecture and social. The beliefs expressed by the Great Pillars may also have changed. The old enclosures may no longer have served the needs of the people. But abandonment does not mean disappearance. The mound preserved evidence of a crucial period in human history. Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that monumental architecture did not require cities, kings, writing, or metal. It showed that communities still dependent on hunting and gathering could plan complex spaces and coordinate demanding construction projects. That discovery changed how archaeologists thought about the beginning of organized. But it did not prove that religion suddenly created agriculture. It did not reveal a forgotten global. And it did not overturn everything known about human history. Göbekli Tepe was part of a wider cultural landscape. Other early Neolithic sites in the region contain related architecture, imagery, and social practice. The people who built this hill were extraordinary, but they were not isolated from their neighbors. Modern theories connect the carvings with constellations, a comet impact, or the Younger Dryas. Others claim the pillars preserve knowledge from an advanced ice age, but no inscription identifies a star map, and no artifact demonstrates advanced machinery or outside. The absence of a complete explanation is not evidence for any explanation. Real questions remain. We do not know the names of the people who gathered here. We cannot translate the animals carved into the pillars. We do not know whether the central figures represented ancestors, spirits, or beings from a shared mythology. The exact ceremonies remain beyond. So do the precise methods used to organize labor and. But uncertainty does not diminish the achievement. It makes the surviving evidence more important. Göbekli Tepe belongs to a moment when people were creating new relationships with food, landscape, community, and memory. Its builders transformed local limestone into places where different groups could meet beneath the gaze of silent stone figures. They did not leave written history. They left something older. A record of cooperation. A record of imagination. And evidence that the human ability to build a shared world began long before the first city. For more ancient mysteries grounded in human evidence, subscribe to Origins in Stone.